Host this talk. It's a little over 90 minutes.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. Special thanks to the Chatham Library. And tonight we'll be speaking about my latest book and how it came to be. Many of you might know me. I've been writing the biography of General Philip Kearny. It's a book I've been working on all of my life for decades. And in fact, Kearny was killed in the Battle of Chantilly in September 1862, but he was one of General McClellan's harshest critics. Kearny had written letters to his friend and lawyer in New Jersey, just decrying McClellan's inability to launch a major offensive early in the war and so on. Well, in June of 1862, Kearny wrote to his friend, and he suspected a member of General George McClellan's staff of giving information away to the enemy. Serious accusation. Now, with Kearny being killed shortly after, there was no investigation. It just went away. Well, when I came to that part of the Kearny biography, and I said to myself that General Kearny would not make a serious accusation against a brother officer unless he had some sort of real reason, some proof. That's when I decided to look into Colonel Thomas Marshall Key. Kentucky-born Colonel Thomas Marshall Key served on the staff of Major General George B. McClellan from 1861 to 1863, and by all accounts, he was no ordinary staff officer. Numerous contemporary sources confirm that Colonel Key maintained a dominating and controlling influence over his commanding general, advising him on war policy and even going so far as ignoring orders from the Lincoln administration, which would eventually cost McClellan his job. Key authored most, if not all, of McClellan's political military orders, including the infamous Harrison Landing letter of July 7, 1862, an impertinent letter to Lincoln advising him on war policy and arguing against the proposed emancipation of slaves. In the years following the war, Thomas Key's peculiar dominance and controlling influence over George McClellan was analyzed by friends and comrades. Many blamed Key for steering McClellan so badly with this dubious political advice that it not only effectively ruined the general's career, but perhaps more tragically, it lengthened the war. How did this single staff officer gain so much control over an army commander, and what was his motivation? And those persons who observed this strange interpersonal relationship later tried to explain the unexplainable. George McClellan of Philadelphia was born in 1826. He graduated second in his class from West Point in 1846, and as a second lieutenant of engineers, he served on the staff of General Winfield Scott in the Mexican War. Scott mentioned McClellan in various battle reports, displaying much, quote, zeal and gallantry. And McClellan did receive the brevets for first lieutenant and captain. Afterwards, after the Mexican War, McClellan was sent to Europe to study European tactics. He was an eyewitness to the Crimean War and wrote about the siege of Sebastopol. And he was, again, one of the most important, well-known members of the Army in the 1850s. But by 1857, he realized that there would be no further advancement in the Army, and he sought the hand of a young lady, the daughter of a fellow officer, Mary Ellen Marcy, her name. And Miss Marcy, in order to win Miss Marcy's hand, he had to have a better source of income. And so he quit the military and took a position as a railroad engineer. Actually, he was the highest paid railroad businessman in the country. I believe his salary was $10,000 a year, which was an incredible sum, and it entitled him to have the means to support his young bride, and they married in the spring of 1860. But the headquarters of the railroad was at that time in Cincinnati. And so the McClellans moved out there, set up house, and George McClellan became friendly with many of the local Democratic gentlemen. This was the summer of 1860, again, during the height of the presidential campaign. McClellan and his next-door neighbor, Thomas Marshall Key, who was a state senator and also a local judge, were supporters of Stephen Douglas against Abraham Lincoln. They did not like the radical Republicans. They blamed them for partially causing the unpleasantness in the country along with the slave owners. Well, though these two gentlemen were in agreement, when war finally came, their shared political viewpoint became the firm foundation of their friendship, and they became inseparable. For the next 4 years, George McClellan and Thomas Key were almost constantly together. The life of George McClellan is well documented. Many, many books have been written about him, but the story of his friend Thomas Key is unknown. Only those who observed both of them, who left letters, diaries, short little essays after the war, that's the only source of information about Thomas Key. One of them, many years after the war, William F. Biddle, who served on staff with McClellan. He served as a captain on McClellan's staff. He wrote a lengthy article for United Service Magazine in 1895, and he was witness to that relationship, and he wrote a first-hand account, an in-depth view on the character of Colonel Key. And Biddle writes, Colonel Thomas M. Key was in many ways a remarkable man. He had served a term with great credit on the Ohio bench and was called Judge Key when in 1860 McClellan first met him as an eminent railroad lawyer in Cincinnati. The two men had much in common in culture and taste to make them congenial companions, and each had strong points of his own which the other knew and admired. Key's individuality was robust and independent and full of surprises as one penetrated his habitual reserve. His reading in general history and literature was wide and was quickly available for argument and precedent, as was his wide knowledge of the law. He had unusually a quiet, impressive manner, rather curt and restrained in speaking, but lest a case of injustice, oppression, or brutality or cruelty came up, and if that occasion served, you found that man capable of fiery indignation, of the most biting sarcasm and invective. When his convictions and feelings were strong, he could pour out convincing argument and persuasive elegance that flowed, that was not easy to resist. Well, another very dramatic account of the Key-McClellan relationship was written by Judge Don Piatt, Ohio judge, friend of Key before, during, and after the war. Piatt joined the military, served, rose to the rank of colonel, and after the war wrote about that unusual relationship, and he considered it almost dastardly. Piatt writes, McClellan had an evil genius unknown to himself and unknown to both friends and enemies. Key was his evil genius. The man who honestly sought to make him great made him a failure. He procured a position on McClellan's staff and not only won the confidence of his general, but from an eccentricity of genius sought to lose himself in the man. A brilliant conversationalist Key was, and at the same time a charming companion, two qualities seldom found in the same person. It was the practice of Key's life to listen much and talk little. Key soon possessed and controlled McClellan without that soldier being aware of his lost identity. McClellan died in this ignorance, and the man speaking through him and who proved his ruin was an unknown to his victim as he is to the world. McClellan's own story, which is the title of McClellan's posthumous memoir, should tell this. But the name of Key seldom appears, and when it does, it is that of an orderly. This obscurity suited Key. Had his chief been a great success, this shrinking from observation would have been the same. This was not the result of a morbid condition. It seemed the normal and healthy nature of the man. We'll go to the next. We have a few illustrations here we'll be putting up this evening. There's Major General George B. McClellan. And we'll go on to the Philip Kearny, who I mentioned earlier, who I'm still working on that biography, by the way. It'll be out hopefully by the turn of the next century. And the next illustration, we'll see General McClellan and his young bride, Mary Ellen Marcy McClellan. Next one. And this gentleman right here, William Dixon. Now, a little bit about Key and his background. Key was born in Kentucky, in Maysville, Kentucky, along the banks of the Ohio River in 1819. Now, went to the best family, very well off, well-to-do. his children all went to boarding schools. In fact, Key's younger sister went to a boarding school in Cincinnati, and one summer, her teacher came to the Key family to visit and stay a while. And so this young school marm comes down from Cincinnati and is living with the Key family. And one day, there was a slave auction in Maysville. And, well, she became very interested. She had never seen a slave auction before. She went there. And that young school teacher was Harriet Beecher. Now, this slave auction became a novel sight to her, as they say. Decades later, when she wrote her book, Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, she used that slave auction from her visit to the Key family in her book. And some people say that book started the Civil War. I think the famous quote from Lincoln when he met Harriet Beecher Stowe was, "Oh, so you're the young little lady that started this great big war." Well, again, Thomas Key, again, going to best schools in Kentucky, he went to law school at Yale. And he had an upperclassman as a mentor. His name was Alphonso Taft, President William Howard Taft's father. Alphonso Taft was the founding member of the infamous Skull and Bones fraternity at Yale, and mentored Key. And I think Key was an underclassman, maybe the second or third year bonesman, one of the first ones. And I found that very interesting because they're considered the power elite and the ones that control everything that I believe I've seen on TV or whatever. Key came back after graduating from Yale, and he and Taft started a law partnership. And they were very successful, made a lot of money. They took on another partner, this gentleman right here, William Dixon. William Dixon's wife was Mary Todd Lincoln's cousin. So he had a direct relationship with the Lincoln family. Dixon was a Republican, though McClellan and Key were very strong Democrats. In fact, Key was called the great compromiser of the Ohio Senate. Could work with either party. They got along well. But he and Dixon were very close. Probably no one knew Key better than this gentleman right here, Dixon. Now, Dixon described Key this way. Key had an innate love of justice. His mind naturally sought out the right, and this he endeavored to secure in defense of all technical rules. Few men could resist his persuasive powers. He was, in the best sense of the word, a born diplomat. He was often selected by his brethren at the bar to settle difficult and personal controversies. He never failed. Key won the heart and had the confidence of all who knew him, a generous man of a nice sense of personal honor, and while ambitious, yet always preferring the advancement of another to his own. Dixon also provides a physical description of Key, as there are no known photographs of Thomas Marshall Key. Dixon writes, and Dixon mentions that Key was affected by melancholy. But Dixon writes, he was a handsome man, rather above medium size, not stout, a manly face with a firm and but genial expression and a smile as lovingly and bewitching as a woman's. And he was beloved by women, yet an unhappy affair in his youth denied him the greatest joy in life, shadowed his days, and doomed him to a lonely existence. Key was accustomed to warn his intimate friends that there was latent insanity in his family and that if anything strange should befell him, this fact must be remembered. Well, when the war breaks out, April 1861, Key again is the great compromiser of the Ohio Senate, is selected by the governor of Ohio to go meet with the governor of Kentucky. Slave state Kentucky and free state Ohio shared the same border. There was a lot of trouble. There was a lot of rabble-rousing and threats of invasion. Well, the Governor Dennison trusted Key to negotiate this non-aggression pact with Kentucky, and he was successful. That shows Key was in the governor's inner circle. And when the governor needed an officer to take command of the Ohio State Militia, Key pointed to his neighbor and good friend, political ally, George B. McClellan, who was made a major general of Ohio militia. Well, McClellan early on, the first staff officer he selected was Colonel Key. We'll go to the next shot. Now, interesting, as McClellan embarked on his Western Virginia campaign, this is Don Piatt, who also joined at that time with Key and McClellan. We'll go to the next. Well, McClellan's West Virginia campaign to free the rebels that were threatening Ohio and the Ohio Valley was mainly a campaign of maneuver. Very little bloodshed. Battle of Rich Mountain, for instance, the rebels capitulated, I believe, 500 some odd prisoners. They were due to exhaustion and hunger. They couldn't retreat any further, and they had to surrender to McClellan. Well, great proclamations were written by Key for McClellan, saying that Western Virginia has been cleared of rebels, and Key made sure to send copies of these proclamations. The proclamations exist. They're in McClellan's papers in the Library of Congress, written on the top in Key's hand as for the Associated Press. And this was to make Key make McClellan a national figure instead of just a commander of Ohio militia. A very interesting account written by Whitelaw Reid, who was later the editor of the New York Tribune, also an American ambassador. He recognized what Key was doing to McClellan early, and Reid wrote, "From the day of General McClellan's first taking the field in West Virginia, he had been accompanied by a staff officer from Cincinnati who was a wily politician and quick to perceive those currents of popular favor. The whirlwind of applause had no sooner set in around the quote-unquote young Napoleon, McClellan, and this astute officer recognized his opportunity. Thenceforward, it was cared for that in whatever McClellan said or did, his sayings and actions should be shaped as not unfit him as a candidate for the Democratic Party in which he was affiliated for the next presidential election. This policy was shrewdly planned out and carried out. Had military success reinforced it, the author, Key, might have been successful." Well, after those successes in Western Virginia, July 21st, 1861 was the disaster at Bull Run. The Union Army was in total defeat, rout to Washington, Confederate victory. Lincoln and the new administration, they needed someone to come in, a new general, to reorganize that force. And who better than the young Napoleon of West Virginia, who, again, had achieved all those successes in the newspapers. And that's who Key cultivated, those newspapers with those brilliant success in Western Virginia. So McClellan is brought in. We'll go to the next. And he reaches Washington. You see, but also Reid wrote, McClellan was troubled with politics when in the Army and allowed his able judge advocate, Colonel Key, to ruin him by letters showing that he was not strictly minding his own business. He should leave politics alone. Well, he didn't listen. So after McClellan arrives in Washington and meets 75-year-old General-in-Chief Winfield Scott, who was very enfeebled, could not mount a horse. He's been in constant service since the War of 1812. Key had been sent to deliver a message to General Scott, and Dixon tells the story that Key arrives one morning, late morning, with that message for Scott, and one of Scott's aides lets him in the room. Scott's taking a nap on the couch, and the old man is probably having a nice nap after breakfast. He was a big eater. In a dazed way, Scott gets off the couch and Key's announced, Colonel Key with an order from General McClellan. And Scott shouts out, who's Colonel Key? Who's General McClellan? And he's obviously befuddled. And the aide, Scott's aide, then tells Colonel Key to come back later this afternoon when the general's more himself. And so Key goes back to McClellan and reports that General-in-Chief Winfield Scott's in senile condition, and he must be replaced. The quote that Dixon says, Key considered Scott a stumbling block, an incubus he must be gotten rid of. Now it became the power grab. Another important fact that must be remembered, when McClellan came from the west, he brought a Secret Service agent with him. His name's Alan Pinkerton. Pinkerton, you know the Pinkerton Agency. Pinkerton was, before the war, excellent at catching bank robbers and train bandits, and now he's brought in to command the Secret Service, the Army Intelligence. He went by the nom de guerre of Major Allen. Well, Major Allen's immediate superior was Colonel Key. Colonel Key's position with Allen, they would interview rebel prisoners, runaway slaves, and try to gather information. A lot of it was misinformation. Pinkerton is known to this day of grossly overestimating the Confederate strengths, whereas some estimates at that time, he was saying there were up to 150,000, 200,000 Confederates right outside Washington. And in actuality, we know there were only 45,000 or so. To his dying day, Pinkerton never changed his mind on his numbers. he stayed with his original numbers. And in fact, when he wrote his book, The History of the Spy and the Rebellion, Pinkerton more or less dedicated the book to Key. And in his preface, he writes, paying high compliment to his immediate superior, he writes, "I must refer also to that valuable assistant both to General McClellan and myself by that wonderful aide-de-camp, Colonel Key. The memory of his devotion and his intelligence services to the cause of the Union is imperishable. No truer or braver man ever drew a sword than this noble and efficient staff officer." Well, there's a plus side to Pinkerton's work in Washington was he did break up several Confederate spy rings, including Rose O'Neal Greenhow. We have her image here, coming up. Right after General Scott. You can see he's old fuss and feathers, as they called him. The next one. Okay, keep going. Now, Rose O'Neal Greenhow, and President Lincoln there, but Rose O'Neal Greenhow was a 40-something Confederate sympathizer, Washington socialite, might be after Pinkerton. She knew everyone in Washington, and her home, senators, congressmen, generals, admirals would go visit, and that's Pinkerton again. Actually, this is interesting. Pinkerton built a house outside of Chicago after the war. We'll go to the next one. And he decorated his home with murals. Now, the house was built in the early 1870s, but these photographs were taken in the 1930s, so they're not the greatest quality. Home no longer stands. These are lost to history, but we do have these photographs. This is General McClellan and staff, okay? Let's go to the close-up, Mr. Britt. And as you can see, McClellan is to the left here, but it's, again, very hard to see. And then there are two officers standing to the McClellan's left. And then you'll see the gentleman with the beard and the slouch hat a little lower there, but that's Pinkerton. To his right are the French princes, the Comte de Paris and the Duc de Chartres, that served on McClellan's staff. But the gentleman standing behind Pinkerton, I believe that's Thomas Marshall Key, according to Dixon's description. And it makes sense that Pinkerton would place his closest friend on staff next to each other. Not a great quality image, but it's all we have. We'll go to the next one. Well, with Rose O'Neal Greenhow, her spy ring was successfully thwarted by McClellan. This is actually the document. Interesting, when McClellan arrived in Washington, he wrote a letter to Lincoln, and this is the letter. And he would like to request that Thomas M. Key may be appointed as one of my aide-de-camps with the rank of Colonel of Cavalry. Now, Key had absolutely no military experience. He didn't even serve in the militia or shoulder a musket, and I think he knew how to ride a horse, but now he's a full colonel of cavalry. And we'll see the back of this document here in the next illustration. Lincoln hesitantly approved it. And you can see this is Lincoln's writing. If it be accommodating to the law, let Thomas M. Key be appointed. The rank was requested by General McClellan. Now we'll go to the next one. Okay. There she is. Now, Rose O'Neill Greenhow had the great aspiring in Washington. She wrote cryptic messages and were able to smuggle them out of her house and meet Confederate couriers. And really, Jefferson Davis, President Davis of the Confederacy, credited her for the victory at First Manassas. Now, she was captured by Pinkerton and interrogated by Key. And in her memoir, she writes quite a bit about Colonel Key. She didn't like Colonel Key. She said he either pretended to be deaf or was deaf because it was give him the excuse of getting very close to her. And he held her hand to examine her hand to see if she had done any work in her life. And she says, I work with my mind, not with my hands, and withdrew from Colonel Key. So she did not like Colonel Key at all. But Colonel Key did facilitate in having her exiled to the Confederacy. She was greeted as a hero in Richmond, heroine in Richmond, and was sent to Europe as an ambassador on behalf of the Confederacy, meeting with Queen Victoria and dining at the Tuileries in Paris, and wrote her memoir of her imprisonment in Washington. And on her return voyage, her blockade runner was being chased by a Union vessel. The blockade runner ran aground, and she was jumping into a rowboat to try to make it to the safety of the North Carolina Outer Banks shore, and fell into the water. She sank to the bottom because in her hoop skirts she had sewn $2,000 in gold, the royalties from her book, or the bag or whatever, but it weighed her down, and she sort of died by her own hand. Next one. Another little interesting thing I'd just like to talk, it's another account of how Key and Pinkerton would exaggerate the numbers of the rebels. And this was written by another judge from Ohio, a good friend of Colonel Key, who happened to be in Washington. And this judge was curious, why aren't we attacking the enemy? Because there was this long lull of inactivity with the formation of the Army of the Potomac. This Judge Daniel Thew Wright of Cincinnati, he knew Key as, quote unquote, an eccentric but able man, and Wright describes meeting Key in Washington at that time. He writes, encountering Colonel Key, it occurred to me that now was the opportunity of discovering how the problem of the war was to be solved, and I, therefore, ventured a leading question as to the existing status. Those who knew Colonel Key will remember how solemn and portentous his manner was, but now his manner was more solemn and more portentous than ever. In the profoundest depths of melancholy confidence, and speaking unutterable thoughts in a terrible whisper, he said, if you have no business here in Washington, get out as soon as you can. This Beauregard is lying over the river with 125,000 men, and he can walk into this city at any time, whenever he chooses. Thew then later says, the awful gravity of this statement enhanced as it was the blood-curdling way that Key told it was overwhelming. Dixon, his partner-in-law, received a letter from Key and was an invitation to join McClellan's staff with the rank of lieutenant colonel and the role of assistant judge advocate. So Dixon leaves Cincinnati, comes to Washington, and he later writes perhaps this is the best account of the goings-on at McClellan's headquarters during that time period. How every evening President Lincoln would arrive for a briefing and would be snickered at behind his back, and as soon as Lincoln would leave, the staff would refer to him as the baboon and all these other disparaging things. Dixon was offended by that. Partially, they were related by marriage, so that wasn't too smart of the other staff officers. But anyway, Dixon wrote a little bit after the war an interesting account. He says, Mr. Lincoln was in the habit of visiting McClellan at his headquarters each evening. And when Mr. Lincoln approached, word went around the president had come and he and the general were to be alone. At this time, Mr. Edwin M. Stanton was a private citizen of Washington, and I soon learned that his relations with McClellan were of the most intimate character, and that McClellan was in constant consultation with him. Edwin Stanton was to be the future Secretary of War, But at that time, he was a private citizen, a lawyer in Washington, friend of McClellan. Stanton knew Key very well in the legal circles of Ohio, and was a frequent guest at the McClellan's headquarters at this time. Well, Dixon continues, as soon as the president departed, the door opened and Mr. Stanton entered in McClellan's room and remained until the small hours of the morning. I was told by a staff officer in the special confidence of the general, of course, Key, that the latter consulted with Stanton about what the president had said. And at the time, it seemed to me there was something unmanly on the part of McClellan in this relationship with Stanton, a certain dependency. Besides, it was unseemly in the general to receive and retire through the front door his commander-in-chief and then introduce, in a sense, secretly through a side door of a private citizen to disclose to him what the president had just said. Determining exactly how much influence Key had in the removal of General Scott and also replacing Secretary of War Cameron with Stanton is impossible to know. But there is an important clue. And this clue can be found in the diary of John Hay. John Hay was private secretary to President Lincoln. And in his diary, under the date of October 26, 1861, he describes a typical evening visit to McClellan's headquarters. Hay writes, "Went over to the general's headquarters and we found Colonel Key there. He was talking also about the grand necessity of an immediate battle to clean out the enemy at once. Key seemed to think that we were ruined if we did not fight. The president asked what McClellan thought about it. Key answered, 'The general is troubled in his mind. I think he is much embarrassed by the radical difference between his views and those of General Scott.' Here, McClellan came in and Key left." Now, what Hay just writes is a perfect example of Key's mastery of manipulation. He's talking the talk that the president wants to hear. The president wants to move this Army of the Potomac, attack the rebels that are merely 20, 25 miles outside of Washington, and he wants something done, an army in motion. Well, Key is telling the president they must fight, they have to. But, there is a problem with General Scott. McClellan doesn't want to go over his head. If Scott was removed, McClellan was in command, then it would be an immediate attack. Well, 5 days after that meeting, after the John Hay diary entry, President Lincoln accepted General Scott's earlier resignation, and Scott was gone, and McClellan was made general-in-chief of all the Union armies. Now, the first person to know about that, of course, Lincoln tells his cabinet officials, but the Secretary of the Treasury was Salmon Chase, good friend from Ohio, good friend of Key before the war, and Chase had sent Key a short note saying, "Take hope, Scott is gone, McClellan is now in command, thank God. Tell no one of this order until it's published." So it was a little private note to Key, and Key knew before anyone else in Washington, outside of the cabinet, of what was happening. Well, nothing happened. McClellan becomes general-in-chief, and another 2 months go by with inactivity, no movement whatsoever. McClellan was in his headquarters, consulting his maps, designing a campaign, and Key, the great compromiser of the Ohio Senate, had his own plan. He was going to craft a piece of legislation. Now, whereas McClellan was going to win the war by sword, Key had the idea to strike at the root cause of the conflict. Go to the next one. Key began writing the District of Columbia Compensated Emancipation Act, which was a federal law abolishing slavery in the district. It compensated owners for freeing their slaves. The law paid the slave owners who were, quote-unquote, loyal to the Union $300 per slave. That dollar amount was argued on the floor of the Senate, some slaves being worth more than others. But it was Key's. We know this now. There's an interesting letter that I found at Salmon Chase's papers. It was a letter written by Thomas Heaton on December 2nd, 1861. And Heaton writes to Chase saying, Judge Key boasts among his friends that his influence is potential just now with Mr. Lincoln in shaping the slavery policy of the administration. And Judge Key, as everybody knows, is as thoroughly pro-slavery as Jeff Davis or the devil could be. Colonel Key's document is the only example of compensated emancipation in the United States, and it ended decades of the national shame, as it was called, of slavery in the District of Columbia. And yet nowhere in this historic law are you going to find the name of Thomas Marshall Key. And that was his desire for anonymity. As Don Piatt said, that's what he preferred, staying back in the shadows. Well, on that, Key's authorship of that bill can be found in the diary of Salmon Chase. December 12, 1861, Chase writes in his diary, Judge Key called and read his draft of the bill for the emancipation of slaves in the District of Columbia. The credit for that law went to a Senator Henry Wilson of Massachusetts. Wilson had served briefly on McClellan's staff. He was sort of a go-between between the Senate and the Army, McClellan. Key used Wilson and put his name on the bill, but Key did that, or wrote that original draft and helped guide that important bill through the legislature. Now, Salmon Chase, I'll tell this short story. He died shortly after the war. His memoirs and diary were edited by another Ohio friend. His name was Robert B. Worden. And Worden provides additional cryptic commentary regarding this mysterious persona of Thomas Key. And Worden writes, Chase lived to congratulate his old friend Thomas Key on the passage of the bill drafted by that strange character, the bill abolishing slavery in the District of Columbia. Queer Colonel Key, how often he did harm when he was earnestly endeavoring to do good. Yet he did great things and good things in his day. I knew him well and loved him well. And although I knew his faults and foibles almost as well as I knew his face and figure. Well, later that bill, it went to the Congress and Senate. It was argued on the floor. It passed and was sent to the White House for Lincoln's signature. Lincoln waited 5 days before signing that bill. The radical abolitionist Charles Sumner of Massachusetts spoke publicly saying, you know who the largest slave owner in the nation is? It's Abraham Lincoln, who owns 3,000 slaves in the district, and he won't set them free. Well, the reason Lincoln was waiting to sign that legislation was because you can be found in the diary of Senator Orville Browning of Illinois. Browning goes to visit Lincoln, and at the White House and inquires about this, why he's not signing the bill right away. Well, Lincoln tells Browning that a good close friend of his, a judge in the district, had several elderly slaves that were part of the family, and he needed some time to get them out of Washington. And as freedom wouldn't benefit them, Lincoln was going to wait a few days to sign that bill. Well, the bill was signed on April 16th, 1862. That's known as Emancipation Day in Washington to this day. And after the war, they would have parades and celebrations and speeches and ceremonies honoring Senator Wilson of Massachusetts, where Key is not mentioned. You won't find him mentioned at all. Chase even writes a letter to Key, congratulating him on the passage of the bill, and says something like, the bill is wholly unchanged from the original that you wrote. Too bad your name's not on it. So I found that to be interesting. Well, we're going to go off to the peninsula with the Army, but in the first, any questions as we go along? We're set? Okay, we'll keep going. Save them to the end. Now that Key had set the template to free the slaves and compensate the owners, Key needed an opportunity to meet one-on-one with the founding fathers of the Confederacy. Now, how would this be done? Not easy. McClellan moves his army to the peninsula. The military history is well documented. Siege of Yorktown, Battle of Williamsburg, Battle of Seven Pines, Fair Oaks. Shortly after that battle, in that battle, Confederate General Joe Johnson was wounded severely, and the Confederate Army was taken over by Robert E. Lee. On June 13th, McClellan wrote to Lee, and it was a letter suggesting a meeting to discuss future prisoner exchanges, not to exchange any prisoners, not to exchange lists of prisoners, but just to discuss prisoner exchange. And McClellan said that he was going to send his confidential aide, Colonel Thomas Key. Lee receives this letter, and the gentleman Lee agrees to meet, and he selects General Howell Cobb of Georgia. Now, Howell Cobb of Georgia was one of the founding fathers of the Confederacy. Some considered him, the leader of the entire secession movement. Now he was a general in Lee's army, and the date and time was picked, Sunday, June 15th, 1862. It would be a one-on-one meeting between Cobb and Key, and it would be held at the Mechanicsville Bridge over the Chickahominy River. Well, that morning, Colonel James Simpson of the 4th New Jersey Infantry was field officer of the day in charge of that sector of the Union line. And he was out inspecting his posts, and word is brought to Simpson that there's a rebel officer trying to cross over into Union lines under a flag of truce. Well, this was a shock to him. He hadn't been notified. And Simpson rides over to the bridge, and there's a little cabin there by the bridge, and he's told that there's a Confederate general and a Union officer having a sit-down in this building, and he's curious. He goes in. He wants whose authority was this to have this meeting. He wasn't sure. Simpson barges in on them, and he's introduced to General Cobb, and he had met Cobb before the war. Cobb was a former Secretary of the Treasury in the Buchanan administration, and Simpson asks for papers, for proof that this parlay was allowed to be taking place. Key introduces himself, hands nervously Simpson some papers, and Simpson looks at them and sees the name of Robert E. Lee on them and McClellan, and steps back outside so these two gentlemen could have a conversation in private. Well, what's interesting, we have an image of Cobb coming up too. We'll go forward to him. On the peninsula. Well, the meeting was held to discuss something very important. In the process, while they were discussing this prisoner exchange, the prisoner exchange took a few minutes to discuss, but then Key changed the topic, and the topic was to be how to find a permanent peace. And Cobb tells Key a permanent peace could be found in a half an hour. A solution to this war, that made Key, that's what they came for. Well, they had a 4-hour meeting. It was timed by Simpson and the other Union officers waiting outside. This olive branch being discussed by Key and Cobb, it was without authority from Washington. The only body that's able to negotiate peace with the Confederacy is the Lincoln administration. Well, anyway, this is not a good thing. Key, right then and there, is negotiating an end to the war, which he had no right to do. Comes back later after that meeting. He goes back to McClellan's headquarters, and he's riding with Colonel Simpson. And Key says something that he turns to Simpson and says, "Boy, those fellows on the other side talk as if they would fight." And Simpson looks at him and says, "Well, what do you mean? We've been fighting them for a year now." He was perplexed at what Key's statement was. And he says, do you think we could reach the southern masses? And Simpson says, we can only reach them if we kill their leaders. So this Key goes back to McClellan's headquarters, and they have an incredible conversation with his general, saying that they can achieve a permanent peace. McClellan thought this information so important that he immediately telegraphed the War Department and tells them that Key had met with Cobb, discussed other things other than prisoner exchange, and there will be a full report made. Key then that night writes this nearly 20-page report detailing what Cobb said to him. And McClellan endorsed the report. It was sent to Washington. McClellan asked that report to the War Department that it be shown to Lincoln, and it was then presented to the president. It was very, you have to remember, this week of June 15th was the height of the Peninsula Campaign, the Siege of Richmond. Lincoln and Stanton are concerned that they're not, McClellan isn't moving, they're not attacking Richmond. Why are they negotiating peace? Why are they talking about peace? Well, a stinging rebuke comes back from Washington saying that flags of truce are to be, only for prisoner exchange, not to be discussing terms with leaders of the Confederacy. This made no matter to Key. Key writes a letter to the Secretary of the Treasury, Chase, and details his meeting, and also tells Chase that the administration must free the slaves of Missouri, and using the example of the District of Columbia Compensated Emancipation Act, they could free the slaves in Missouri, compensate the owners, and again, use that as an example for the rest of the South and try to, again, negotiate a peaceful end of the war and bring back the southern states under the constitutionality of the old Union. Well, that day after writing that letter to Chase, in which, interesting, I think we have a copy of that letter, interesting is that McKee refers to himself as McClellan's quote-unquote political advisor. And that's the actual letter saying, I am the general's political advisor. And not every general had a political advisor, but McClellan did. We'll go to the next one. That's dated June 19th, 1862. Now, the only one interested in pursuing peace on the peninsula was Key and McClellan. Robert E. Lee had no interest in pursuing peace on the McClellan. He was going to gather up his army and attack McClellan, drive him away from Richmond, and started formulating his plans. Right before the beginning of the 7 days battles, McClellan had offered, he telegraphs Lincoln, and he offers to send his views on the war, his opinion of how the war policy should be. Lincoln says, don't send anything yet. The telegraphs are not secure. I'd be glad to hear your views on the war, but not now. So things were delayed, and the 7 days is what got in the way, the 7 days battles. McClellan's army is driven from Richmond. They retreat to Malvern Hill, then to Harrison's Landing. The army is beaten. They're secure now at Harrison's Landing, and Lincoln is concerned about the condition of the Army of the Potomac, and he announces that he's going to visit the army and inspect the army and meet with McClellan. Well, this was good news for McClellan and Key. Now they were able to present their views to McClellan, or to Lincoln in person. And this is the letter. This is, if you look up top, you'll see confidential. Headquarters, Army of the Potomac, camp near Harrison's Landing, July 7th, 1862. And it's a letter. It's in Thomas Key's handwriting. This is the infamous Harrison Landing letter, the letter that dictated war policy to Lincoln. It told Abraham Lincoln, don't make this a war of emancipation. Don't free the slaves. And again, if you look at the letter, it's a joint composition. The first two paragraphs are by McClellan, Army business and the current condition of the Army. But then it begins to talk about the war policy. And a lot of people might say that that Key was merely a military secretary, a secretary to the general taking dictation, but that's not the case. And those who knew Key and McClellan together all comment that Key was the actual author of the letter. And Colonel Don Piatt is one that writes. We'll read four of the few I have here. There was no doubt whatsoever as to state the fact that Colonel Tom Key was the author of all McClellan's orders that had a political bearing and wrote for him the infamous Harrison Landing letter, which slapped the administration so squarely in the face. Judge Wright, who we mentioned earlier about outside of Washington and the rebel army, Wright wrote, Key was the reputed author of the celebrated Harrison Landing letter, in which McClellan undertakes to instruct Mr. Lincoln on his military and civil rights duties and obligations. As a specimen of pure, unadulterated impudence, there was never anything like it in the world, and Key had an ability of impudence which was a talent amounting to genius. Judge Dixon writes, "The clamor was loud for an abolition war. McClellan trembled, and he did not want to give up his command, but how could he lead in such a war? Hence the letter. The composition is Key's, the thoughts McClellan's, except the slight infusion of Key's abolition with compensation." Captain Biddle of the staff wrote, "I have long felt sure that Key's influence was the cause of McClellan sending the July 7th letter to President Lincoln, and it was to Key's inspiration as to be ascribed much of its manner and of its matter. He was one of those most devoted friends of McClellan who was not always his safest advisors." Well, we'll go to the next. It's actually, the 3-page letter exists as part of the Abraham Lincoln papers in the Library of Congress. And as you see here, these are, I use this in the book as samples of Key's handwriting to show, without a doubt, the first letter was a letter written to Chase. The second letter is the Harrison Landing letter to President Lincoln, and the next one is another letter written to Chase. But as you can see, they're all in Key's handwriting. Go to the next. The final page of that Harrison Landing letter, you can see actually it has McClellan's signature on the bottom. He did sign it. The body of the letter, again, written all Key's thoughts. First 2 paragraphs, McClellan. The last 2 paragraphs are McClellan. The key phrase is the telling word "should." I believe Key used the word, you should do this, you should do that to the president. I think he said 14 times he uses the word "should," telling the president what to do to, the democratic policy of the war. The same general that had been driven from the battlefields of in front of Richmond now had a genius for war policy. Go to the next one. Oh, there's one after. Well, Lincoln arrives at Harrison's Landing, inspects the army, and after the day-long inspection, goes to McClellan's quarters. McClellan hands him the letter. Lincoln sits down, begins to read, and reads this long letter in Key's script. He had read Key's report of the Key-Cobb meeting a week or so earlier. Now he's reading the war policy set by McClellan in Key's handwriting. And after he's finished, Lincoln just said, matter-of-factly, he said, "Much obliged." And he folded it and put it in his pocket, and that was the end of it. Key was furious. That was only the opening salvo for him. 2 days later, he writes a letter to Secretary of the Treasury Chase, a letter that I found in Dixon's papers that had never been published before. It goes beyond the original Harrison Landing letter. Key says in the second letter, he says, "I have lost all hope in the president, and he has very little mind or heart, and he thinks poorly and feels feebly, and he judges the president, quote, guilty of a crime for which he can make no atonement." So Key spews out this disgust for Lincoln for not abiding by that original Harrison Landing letter. Now, Chase, what's interesting about the Chase letter, what I call the second Harrison Landing letter, is that there's 4 pages in Key's handwriting, but the all-important signature page is missing. Now, what was on that page? We have a clue. And that clue can be found in the July 22nd diary of Secretary Chase. Chase receives the letter from Key. He writes on July 22nd, "This morning I called upon the President with a letter received from Colonel Key, in which he stated that he had reason to believe if General McClellan is removed from the Virginia Peninsula, he will declare the liberation of slaves and that the President will dare not interfere with that order. I urge the President the importance of an immediate change of command of the Army of the Potomac, representing the necessity of having a general in the command who would coordinate and effectively cooperate with the other movements of other generals." I said that I did not regard McClellan as loyal to the administration, although I did not question his general loyalty to the country. Well, that's what was in the missing page of that second Harrison Landing letter, a threat to free the slaves of Virginia. And interesting now, within a 3 or 4 week period, Lincoln had read the Key-Cobb Parley report. He had read the Harrison Landing letter of July 7th, and now he read the second Harrison Landing letter written to Chase. Nearly 20 pages, all written in Key's distinct script. And if Key was so far succeeding in hiding his political interference, if that game was over. Lincoln now realized that Key was interfering with war policy or the conduct of the war. Well, Lincoln had brought in this gentleman here, General Halleck from the West, to become general-in-chief. And he also brought in General John Pope to command the Army of Virginia, a newly created army of several separate smaller units to try to get on the offensive somewhere in Virginia. Now, Pope, with great bombast, issued an order, threatening the civilians of Virginia that if they interfere with his army, he would hang them on the spot, and so on and so on. And that order created much anger in Richmond. And it also created a lot of anger at McClellan's headquarters. McClellan and Key always insisted to conduct this war in a civilized manner, under Christian civilization and so on. They were offended by Pope's order, and they were so offended that they wanted to write an order of their own that would, quote unquote, slap Pope in the face. And this was General Order 154. In which McClellan states to his army how to conduct themselves in Virginia and what their policy would be. Now, interesting, there's a letter that Key wrote to Chase in August, and he says, here's a copy of General Order 154 written by me. And then there are letters that McClellan wrote to his wife saying, here's a copy of General Order 154 written by me. So who's lying here? To me, they were one and the same. They wrote together. It wasn't just one or the other. Well, before issuing that order, General Order 154, in which they were going to state their war policy, and slap General Pope in the face, they thought it would be very important to get the opinion of a lowly Confederate trooper, prisoner. So they sent for this prisoner, a private from the ranks, and this interview is in McClellan's papers, and I nearly fell out of my chair when I was reading it. I've never read anything like it in all these so-called prisoner interviews that Key did. And this young trooper named Burgess from a Virginia cavalry unit is given an iced mint julep, and he's made comfortable. They feed him, and they start asking him certain questions about the Battle of Malvern Hill, and he answers them. But then there's a bizarre question, and it says, what would be the effect of McClellan issuing an order pursuing an entirely different course from General Pope? Answer, I think if this course was pursued by General McClellan, it would produce a different feeling. It would create confidence. It would have a good effect and as tending to bring about a reconciliation between North and South. For the South looks upon General McClellan as a very honorable and high-minded soldier who is fighting to uphold the Constitution and not to crush the South. That does not sound like a 19-year-old Confederate trooper from Virginia, but that's what was in the prisoner interview. That was what given to McClellan. And the result was that General Order 154. Well, General Halleck ordered McClellan's army off of the peninsula and were ordered to Washington to cooperate with Pope's army. Now, there was a lot of foot dragging, we'll call it that, by McClellan. A lot of excuses. There was a very slow go. 2 Army Corps were sent to aid Pope, but it took several weeks for McClellan to get up there. And we'll go to the next one. Don Piatt again. Well, Don Piatt is now serving in Virginia, and he is in Washington. He's on a 30-day leave, and they know the Battle of Second Bull Run is taking place. Now, Piatt wants to get to his command, and he meets Key. Key is outside of Washington with McClellan's staff, and they're sending no help to Pope's army. And Piatt writes a very interesting account. He says, during Pope's campaign, when his little army stood between Lee and the capital, holding the Confederates at bay until McClellan could come up with his forces from the James, I made an attempt to join my general. Knowing Colonel Tom Key, McClellan's confidential aide and author of all that sham Napoleon's orders, I sought and found that brainy man and kind-hearted gentleman and stated my difficulty. He conducted me to the headquarters tent, where I found a number of officers reading newspapers, talking and smoking. The appearance usually was that of easy repose. The continuous roar of artillery that told of a fight going on, or seemed rather to soothe rather than to disturb those epauletted heroes. I was introduced to other officers of the staff, but could get no reliable information. I did, however, hear enough to satisfy me that the officers there assembled had very little interest in the struggle that was going on, as they laughed at my earnest demands sent by telegraph to General McClellan from the War Department to hurry his troops to the front. Nor could I discover from the road which I must take to get to the front. I did not see General McClellan. I asked Colonel Key to get an opinion from him, and after an hour's delay, I learned from Colonel Key that it was the opinion at headquarters that I only had to remain where I was, and my command, or what might be left of it, would come tumbling back to join me. Does General McClellan know if so grave a disaster has occurred, I asked? Key replied, he knows only that John Pope is in command, and that means the same thing. On asking Colonel Key if no aid was to be sent Pope, Key answered that Lincoln, Stanton, and Halleck were telegraphing to that effect like frantic old women, but McClellan knew better, and what was more good for them than they did themselves, and that this fool Pope was in a scrape, as we all knew he would be, and it would take all of McClellan's forces to defend Washington. Now, this article here, after the disaster at Second Bull Run, McClellan was kept in command by Lincoln. The famous quote, Lincoln says, we must use the tools that we have. They couldn't get rid of McClellan. There was a rebellion in Lincoln's cabinet to have McClellan arrested and removed from command, but he had no choice. So Lee is now invading Maryland after his victory at Second Manassas, and McClellan's army is McClellan is trying to rebuild his army and go after Lee. Well, there was on that march from Washington to Frederick, Maryland, there was a reporter from the New York Tribune. His name was Nathaniel Page, and he was a friend of Key's. Key, would feed him information, and this day they wrote upon, Page's accompanying the army, and he writes a very interesting account. This actually came out a few years after the war. Key thing is it says that never got into history. This was something that was kept quiet. Nobody wrote about this after the war. But Nathaniel Page, who knew Key, says, I was with Pope's army as a correspondent of the Tribune at the Second Bull Run battle. General Porter did not intend to help Pope win that battle. He was no worse than a dozen officers, however, who belonged to the McClellan faction. They were all traitors at heart. And after McClellan was restored to command, the army marched through Maryland to intercept Lee. A plot was formed to countermarch to Washington, expel Stanton from the War Office, and compel Lincoln to change the policy of the war. And the reporter says that never got into history. No, it did not. It was one of the unwritten chapters, and I will tell you how I came to know of it. 3 days before the Battle of Antietam, I had quarters one night in a farmhouse. Judge Key of McClellan's staff rode up about dark and told me he felt too ill to sleep in a tent or on the ground. I offered to share my room with him. A headache prevented him from sleeping, and he talked a large part of the night. He told me of a plan to countermarch on Washington and intimidate the president had seriously been discussed the night before by members of McClellan's staff, and that his opposition to it, he thought, caused its abandonment. Judge Key was a lawyer of unusual ability and a high social standing in Cincinnati. I did not doubt his entire accuracy of his statement. Indeed, I was not greatly surprised at the time, for I knew the men that McClellan had gathered around him were all copperheads who had no heart in the war. Did Judge Key say that McClellan was himself concerned in a plot to turn back the army on Washington and allow Lee to invade the North? Page responds, Key did not know if McClellan knew of it. The officers who had advocated at the secret council did not claim to have broached the plan to him. He seemed to think they could win him over to it. What was the change of policy they intended to force upon Lincoln, the reporter asked. Page, the abandonment of all interference with the institute of slavery. If he would guarantee the perpetuity of slavery, they thought the war could be brought to an end. Page went to his grave believing that there truly was a conspiracy on that march through Maryland. Go to the next one. Okay, we even go to the next. Well, approaching Antietam, McClellan took on a new member of the staff. His name was David H. Strother, Colonel. Strother was an artist before the war. He was a loyal Virginian. He was born in the Valley. Knew the area literally like the back of his hand, and was brought along on staff to make maps for the general, and knew the roads, the whole lay of the land. Now, Strother's name before the war was pen name was Port Crayon, the pencil carrier, and he would make sketches of the field. And his journal that he kept during that campaign is probably the best that I've ever read. The original journal is in the University of West Virginia. It was heavily edited during the centennial years in the 1960s, but really that original diary is the best. We'll go to the next. He mentions Key many, many times in his journal, and they seem to have become good friends. And it was during the Battle of Antietam, Strother writes in his journal, this was the part of the field where Key was, Burnside's Bridge. You might recognize that. During the assault on September 17th on the bridge, General Burnside was a little slow in getting started. Confederates defended it well. It took time. Message after message was sent from McClellan's headquarters. Why isn't Burnside moving? Burnside finally takes the bridge. It's now 1 o'clock in the afternoon. After taking the bridge, he's supposed to push on and attack Lee at Sharpsburg, but there were more delays. And Key, according to Strother, rides to Burnside's Bridge, rides to meet with General Burnside, and he's carrying a note in his pocket. And that note was going to relieve General Burnside on the spot if he had not gotten moving. Now, what's interesting, that note was never delivered. Burnside remained in command, but it was perhaps the most important undelivered note written during the war. The entire war, the future of the war would have changed had Key delivered that order. We'll go on. Now, immediately after the Battle of Antietam, again, we know all about that. After the battle, according to Strother, Key and several others consulted with McClellan. McClellan had made up his mind to attack Lee's army, but Strother says he was talked out of it by a book soldier. Now, this was Strother's illustration of the so-called book soldier that talked McClellan out of attacking Lee after Antietam. What exactly is a book soldier? Well, there is no official term, book soldier. It's someone I feel that is well read in military practice and theory, certainly not a West Pointer. At that time, McClellan had 36 West Pointers on his staff. It was only Key and one or two other members. One was a medical director that had no military training. And remember, Biddle said, again, Key was well read in military theory. So was it Key that talked McClellan out? And the quote that Strother uses sounds like Key, but I can't confirm it 100%. So we'll go to the next. This is shortly after the Antietam battle. Strother and Key ride to a little farmhouse outside of Sharpsburg, and the farmer was selling buttermilk, and Strother drew the illustration. Strother's holding the horse. The gentleman with the beard there is holding his horse, and the one to his left, that's the only known portrait of Colonel Thomas Marshall Key that can be found. Well, immediately after that battle of Antietam, go to the next. Interesting thing happened. General Kearney, as you know, I mentioned earlier, he had been killed on September 1st, 1862, at the Battle of Chantilly. His body had fallen into Confederate hands. His horse, saddle, and sword were captured by the Confederates. Lee returned the body under a flag of truce the next day. The sword, horse, and saddle were kept as trophies. Well, General Kearny's body was returned to New Jersey, and Mrs. Kearny on September 5th, a few days later, wanted her husband's possessions back. So she wrote a letter to General Robert E. Lee asking for those things, and that letter was sent care of the War Department through General Halleck to McClellan to be forwarded to Lee. Halleck, I think, ordered McClellan on September 10th, and the order I'm remembering from my mind, says, by the first flag of truce, please forward Mrs. Kearny's letter to General Lee, so on and so on. So on September 10th, well, the armies were in motion, marching through Virginia, and then the Battle of Antietam is being fought. There was no chance to send Mrs. Kearny's letter. The first available flag of truce was immediately after the Battle of Antietam. And what's interesting, this started a series of back-and-forth correspondence between Lee and McClellan. In 1864, McClellan denied having any communication whatsoever with Robert E. Lee before, during, or after the Battle of Antietam. It simply is a misstatement. It's not true. They're in the official records. Those letters exist. But what doesn't exist is that first letter from McClellan to Lee, which accompanied Mrs. Kearny's letter. And there are accounts. When that letter arrived at Lee's headquarters, it raised a few Confederate eyebrows. This gentleman right here, Senator Augustus Bacon from Macon, Georgia. Okay. It served as he was the adjutant of the 9th Georgia Infantry during the war. After the war, got involved in Georgia politics, and was elected three terms to the U.S. Senate. In 1868, he was a delegate from Georgia going to the Democratic National Convention in New York City. They were going to nominate a new candidate to run against Grant for president. And this was the first convention since 1860 that the southern states would be part of. And actually, Nathan Bedford Forrest was one of the delegates at that New York convention. Well, Bacon here is in Cincinnati, and he's going to take the train to New York City. And the person sitting next to him on that train was the Ohio delegate, Colonel Thomas Marshall Key. Bacon and Key, chit-chat about the war and their roles in that war. And Bacon later wrote an account of that, and it will show that there was more to this peace policy, this so-called possible march on Washington and defection of or mutiny of the Army of the Potomac. Well, Bacon wrote this letter in 1872, and he says, I frequently heard on the day succeeding the Battle of Sharpsburg in 1862, communications passed between General Lee and General McClellan, the object which was to secure a truce for 90 days with a view to the final cessation of hostilities. That they nearly had an interview on the subject, and that General Howell Cobb, and at that time an officer in Lee's army, was very active in the effort to secure that peace talk. Excuse me. It had been for some time my intention to question General Cobb about that matter, but I had never have done so before June of 1868, when upon the railroad cars between Cincinnati and New York, I formed the acquaintance of a lawyer by the name of Key. He was a prominent man in Ohio and had been since the war several times the Democratic candidate for judge of the Supreme Court of the state. In conversation with him, he informed me that he was, during the years 1861 and 1862, the confidential staff officer of General McClellan. I embraced the opportunity to inquire of him concerning the truth of the rumor I had heard. He stated to me that the day after the Battle of Sharpsburg, a very strong effort was made by a number of prominent officers of the Federal Army to induce General McClellan to address General Lee in a proposition to declare a truce preparatory to a peace, in which they urged the people wanted and would have, if offered an opportunity, to secure it. General McClellan himself sympathized with the subject, but said that under other circumstances, he would favor the movement and assist in forwarding it. He knew that then it would be useless for him to attempt it, for the reason he said was that for 8 months he was the subject of the most unwarrantable persecution at the hands of the administration, that if he should declare a truce, it would be repudiated by Lincoln, who would take advantage of the action to ruin him officially and disgrace him before the people. Key added that the causes of Mr. Lincoln's dislike of General McClellan was two. Even at that early day, Mr. Lincoln had his eye on a second term, and very soon after he placed McClellan in command of the Army of the Potomac, he discovered that McClellan's popularity would make him a dangerous rival in the affections of the people. Again, McClellan refused to conduct the war in otherwise in a civilized manner as he understood it. His campaigns were directed against the armed foe, not against non-combatants. That's Key's saying. That's what he wrote all the time. Well, Bacon goes back to Georgia after this Democratic convention, after his meeting with Key, and he goes to talk with General Cobb, and continues. He goes, during the just previous to General Cobb's death, because Cobb dies only a week or so after this, without relating to him what I'd been told by McClellan's staff officer, I took the occasion to ask him about the Sharpsburg truce. He stated that no communication passed between the two generals upon the subject of the truce, but there was an effort made in the Confederate Army to open up such negotiations. The following is a brief statement of the facts in which he related to me. On the day after the battle, General Howell Cobb and several other prominent officers of the Confederate Army had a conversation concerning the war, its character, and its possible duration, result, etc. They were convinced that unless the war was ended by diplomacy, the only termination could be found in the utter ruin of one section or the other. They agreed that very day was the time to make a settlement. Impressed with the strength of these views, they determined to submit them to General Lee, and they at once secured an interview with him. When they entered his office, General Lee had in his hand a letter from General McClellan relative to the return of the horse of General Phil Kearny, who had been killed a few days before at Chantilly. General Cobb laid the views upon the subject of the truce before General Lee and urged their desire as strongly as circumstances would permit. General Lee expressed himself in full sympathy with them, but could not be brought to believe that their efforts could be met with success. He distrusted President Davis's approval of such a step and was satisfied that Mr. Davis would disapprove of a request of an interview with McClellan. General Cobb replied that if he would allow him to answer that letter in General Lee's name, which he held in his hand from McClellan, he pledged himself without writing anything else but General Kearny's horse and saddle and sword. He, General Lee, would have in no less than 12 hours receive a letter requesting an interview. How could Cobb make a statement like that, saying, let me write that letter, I will mention nothing but General Kearny's horse, saddle, and sword, and you'll have a meeting with McClellan in 12 hours. Well, Cobb knew all he had to do was address that letter to Key, and their meeting, that proposed peace would possibly happen. It didn't happen, as we know. It all failed. But it's an interesting fact that in both armies, there was talk of bringing about peace in 1862. Back to Washington quickly. In the 1 week after the Battle of Antietam, we'll go to the next. There was a casual conversation in the War Department. One officer said to another that, why wasn't Lee's army destroyed after the Battle of Antietam? And the other officer responded by saying, well, that's not the game. The game is that no army shall take advantage or have an advantage over one another. Look at the next one. That's Lincoln and McClellan. That was Bacon's letter. And the next one. The next, this officer that said publicly that it wasn't the game of winning the war. It was a game of not letting any side take advantage of one another. Well, when that officer said those things were reported to Lincoln, and that officer was summoned to the White House, and Lincoln conducted a drumhead court-martial. And that was, who said those things was Major John James Key, brother of Colonel Thomas Key. Key brothers were alike in many ways, and it wasn't an exaggeration. That was the war policy. Major Key was dismissed for making those statements, and several other people complained to Lincoln, "Why are you dismissing him for telling the truth?" Major Key had served with Colonel Key during that Second Manassas campaign. They were in charge of shipping men in and out of Alexandria. Well, we know McClellan, shortly after Antietam, was relieved of duty, sent to New Jersey, to Trenton, to report and wait for further orders, which never came. This gave Key went with McClellan, and McClellan runs for president in 1864. Key is his unofficial campaign manager. Now, back then during conventions, candidates didn't go to the convention; they remained home, and Key was sent to the Chicago convention. McClellan remains in New Jersey, and there are letters written by Key to McClellan discussing their plans for the upcoming election and the campaign. That was Key's plan all along, to make McClellan president, and that's, again, what others have said. It didn't work. McClellan was beaten badly in that November election. President Lincoln's reelected. McClellan decided that after that loss, he was going to leave the United States, and he was not going to come back to the country until the Democrats nominated someone else in 1868. And he remained true to his word. Stayed over in Europe, and only came back after that convention. And he arrives in Philadelphia, and word spreads out in the city that McClellan is in town, staying at the Continental Hotel. So that evening, there was a big torchlight parade of veterans, bands playing, and they all march over to the Continental Hotel, and McClellan goes out on the balcony, and he makes a short speech to the assembled masses. And everybody cheers, and McClellan goes back inside and has dinner. The crowd goes away. And the next day in the newspapers, a reporter writes something very interesting. He says, Judge Thomas Key, a well-known Ohio politician, well, the judge is not in Philadelphia, and I have searched all the hotel registers to reach this conclusion, but he is not in Philadelphia. This was once a mystery, but it has been revealed. So long as Judge Key retained position on General McClellan's personal staff, it was observed that, however doubtful might be his achievements with the sword, the general's pen and tongue were always ready and well spoken. Excuse me. Whoever reads McClellan's speech may now see why we are sure that Judge Key was not at his friend's elbow. But with or without his mentor, the general is cautious. He is the last candidate of a great party for the presidency. The party has seized upon him, and on the moment of his return to this country, they asked him to preside at a mass meeting. He coldly acknowledged his allegiance, but denied that it involves any duties. He may be sophomoric with his mentor away, but he is sure, now as always, to be cautious. Well, that reporter knew that McClellan couldn't make a speech without Key being present. The reporter didn't know that Thomas Key was home in Ohio dying. He had contracted like tuberculosis, camp fever, typhoid during the war, and he was, after that return from New York City, that Democratic convention, he literally took to his deathbed. So from September, October, November, December 1868, Key is dying. He knows he's going to die. He, on a Monday, he orders a pen and paper, and he writes to William Dixon, his former partner. Oh, come on. He tells Dixon, he writes out his last will and testament, and he instructs Dixon, quote, destroy every paper belonging to me, end quote. Now, for a reason, those papers most likely would have fallen into or been seen by others, looked at by others, and ruined McClellan's future political ambitions. Some of those papers did escape the flames. That's the good thing. In fact, interesting note, the Cincinnati Gazette made note. They called for after Key's death. They asked for the publication of his papers. They said, "We do not know where his papers are, but we do know he wrote letters to the president and signed in McClellan's name and so on." And they called for an investigation. Nothing was done. They didn't know Key's papers were destroyed. I found, like I said earlier, I found William Dixon's papers, and he did not burn everything. One other piece of request that Key had, that he was to be buried on the west side of this monument. And under no circumstances may his name be carved into that monument. Again, that desire for anonymity to stay mysterious. Piatt said loving hands later put an inscription there, and that'll be on the next shot. The Spring Grove Cemetery in Cincinnati. Died on January 19th, 1869. Now, after his death, the New York Tribune wrote an obituary. And they said, "The country has reason, perhaps, to complain of a large influence Key exerted over General McClellan in the inspiration and also in the actual composition of many of the letters on political subjects with which General McClellan helped to embarrass the administration and distract the public sentiment concerning the war. But it has reason also to be grateful for the remembrance of the fact that Thomas M. Key was the author of the first congressional bill for the emancipation of slaves in any part of the United States." Well, Key faded into history with no papers, no trail, no photographs, became forgotten. McClellan's own memoir, McClellan's own story, you won't find the name of Key. I mean, he's mentioned 2 or 3 times, and it's a simple delivering a message, acting as an orderly. Why is that? McClellan, give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he was protecting his friend who preferred to be invisible, and that McClellan was doing his friend a favor. Or perhaps McClellan resented what Key did. McClellan made no public statement or did not acknowledge the passing of his friend Thomas Key. And if you look at any McClellan family diary, you're not going to see any mention whatsoever of Key's passing. You examine McClellan's papers, and they've almost been cleaned with bleach. Key's name is almost completely removed from McClellan's papers. You'll see some letters in Key's hand, but they are all unsigned. Don Piatt was one who said, in the end, Key probably would have wanted it that way. He said that obscurity suited Key. And had his chief McClellan been a great success, the shrinking of observation would have been the same. When Key returned to Cincinnati to die of that disease, Piatt said, "You know what they should have carved on that monument? Here lies the evil genius of George McClellan." He blamed, Piatt blamed Key almost entirely for McClellan's failure. And you see this article here. It's from the Commercial Gazette of Cincinnati. McClellan and Key, was their intimacy charged with the former's failures? Why have historians missed this? Why have they forgotten about it? Well, as one said, Key has flown under the radar for 150 years. Why wasn't he detected? And it's because he did his best to cover his tracks. I just could not let him remain in that the long shadow of Little Mac. I had to shine light on him and tell his story. It's an important story for his Civil War historians when you think of all the books that have been written about. And Antietam, the Peninsula Campaign, McClellan, everything, every character has been studied, digested, and analyzed, all except Colonel Thomas Key. And this was a figure that had so much control over one of the most powerful men in the country. Had he persuading McClellan not to advance the army, not to attack, to try to negotiate peace. His interference, I'll blame him for the casualties of 1863, 4, and 5, where the war could very well have been ended in 1862. McClellan said it all in his relationship with Key. And this was a letter of introduction that McClellan wrote to a friend in New York. And he said, if you don't know Key and if you have not met him, speak freely to him. What you say to him is as if said to me. They were one and the same. From this moment forward, no book on McClellan can be written without mentioning his confidential aide, his political advisor. And like I say, I want history to judge them forever together. Thank you. We'll do some questions. It's hot in here, I know. And I'll try to do my best to answer them. Questions? You have the microphone? Go ahead.
After you did all this research, did you not feel that there was great mental instability in Key? He was like a megalomaniac. He was up and down. I mean, serious mental problems?
Very well so. And that's what he admitted to Dixon, that there was insanity in his family. And if anything strange had happened to him, remember that. And that's what they would say. He had a reserved manner, but then would become manic. And I think, that they were alter ego. McClellan, he was accused of being timid and weak and indecision, whereas, Key had all that self-confidence and ability and political, ambition that they fit together. And that's what biographers have missed on McClellan, that he could not function without Key. And like I say in the book, McClellan would never have a career that he did without Thomas Key. And that was in some ways a good thing and a bad thing. It's beyond understanding how McClellan could allow this obscure private citizen to manipulate and control war policy and push that war policy on the Republican administration. Somebody had a question? Yeah.
It sounded very much like McKee was, or that Keyes was playing both sides in terms of not emancipating the slaves, from what you have said. Do you think that he was trying to position McClellan so that he would be a favorable Democratic contender in the next upcoming presidential elections?
It was the alternative to Lincoln. And, Key and McClellan blamed Lincoln for the war. I mean, there's letters that Key wrote where he blames this entire war on Lincoln. And it was Key's plan at the beginning to groom McClellan to be the Democratic candidate to run against the president and to mold him and shape him and write these war policy letters and orders, and more or less to bide time. And that was the problem. The election was going to be in 1864, so this is 1862. And at that so-called book soldier that told McClellan not to advance after Antietam, that book soldier says to McClellan, wait, Lee's army is still dangerous. Let them go, and we can rebuild our army, and 300,000 new recruits are coming. We need to train them and make them a machine. And it was all, again, a waiting game. And if they could just wait and push it off another year or two. And but then, unfortunately, a lot of men got killed with that mindset. Okay. All right. Well, then, thank you very much. I appreciate you all coming out on a warm evening. And feel free to ask me more questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you.